I'm Jeanne-Marie Gescher. I'm the author of a book called All Under Heaven with a question mark, China's Dreams of Order. And I guess one thing that not many people might know about me, except of course everybody who knows me, is that I'm not quite 5 foot tall. I have to say first of all that I started to write it quite a long time ago. I've lived in China for 25 years. I've spent most of that time advising governments and businesses. And what I felt throughout that time was that it has become not only fashionable, but a fundamental aspect of the way that the West sees the world, to look at everything through the prism of economics. The difficulty of looking at everything through the prism of economics, not that there's anything wrong with economics, is that economics in and of itself is not everything. By the time we got to about 2009, so I had been doing that kind of work for over 20 years, I began to think that it was quite important to help people understand that we live in a world that goes beyond economics. And I decided that there were 4 things that we really needed to think about in our bigger world. And one of them was whether we wanted to live under a single top-down mind or whether we wanted to live in a world with voices from the ground. But if we wanted to live in a world with voices from the ground, how were we going to do that? So I guess you could frame that as a question of democracy, but I think you're kind of missing the point if you do it. It's a bigger question than just democracy or no democracy. I also thought that we need to think about knowledge. If you speak Sanskrit, you understand that knowledge is more than facts. But in the West, and given that we tend to look at everything through an economic perspective, we think about knowledge in terms of facts. The result is that we've narrowed our understanding, our ability to ask questions. So I thought it would be important to look at what knowledge is in that widest possible perspective. There's a great South African author who sadly died recently, but died of old age after a long and wonderful life, and she once said, her name was Nadine Gordimer, she once said, "The truth is always so much more than facts." I also thought that it was kind of important to understand the wild world. So we can think of the wild world as nature. Look at forests, for example. That looks pretty wild to us, looks pretty chaotic. But also this idea of lots of different people having different ideas about freedom looks pretty chaotic. And I thought we needed to understand that a bit more. So I decided I'd write one book. I called it Soul States. I decided I'd write one book and I would look at those 4 questions through 4 countries. And I thought that I would choose a country for each issue, being the country that most illustrated what that issue was. So not necessarily the country that had answered that question, but the one through which we could think about that question most easily. And I guess hardly surprisingly, China became the country through which I wanted to tell that story of order. India was the country that I chose to tell the story of the question of knowledge. South Africa was the country that I chose to explore that idea of being human. And Brazil, which not only has the world's biggest surviving rainforests, but which is also home to more people from more different places, each with their own individual idea of freedom, I thought that would be the place through which to write the story of the wild world. It was one book. I started it in 2009, and in 2012, when I'd written about 2/3 of all of the parts, I decided to split them up and turn them into 4 books. So I went back and I rewrote the China part, and I've just finished the first of the books, which is, as I said, All Under Heaven, China's Dreams of Order. Yes, it was difficult in the sense it took a long time. It was absolutely fascinating. What was really interesting for me was that as I was writing it, I felt that history was repeating itself. My book tells the story of China from the beginning of time, the point at which myth blurs with history, up to the present day. The going back to pull together what that story was required much more than just reading a few history books. One of the challenges is that when we read history books, what we're really reading is someone who's telling us chronologically what happened. In India, you have a number of wonderful historians and you have a very different idea about history. You have this idea that history is not linear. How could you possibly tell a story in a linear fashion, because so much happens at the same time that's not one story. But histories that have been written about China and other countries are told in a linear fashion. They also tend to be told as the story of the state, and I wanted to write a story of the people. So I found that one of my biggest challenges was working out where to go to find the answers to my questions. So I had to read a lot about archaeology, a lot about myth, a lot about philosophy, as well as the history. I guess that was possibly the most challenging thing. Perhaps equally, I would say that in the last 2 years, politically, China has become more challenging. And although my book is not, it's not a political book with a capital P, but it is a book that asks us to question ourselves about what our idea of order is all over the world, not just about China. I'm a barrister by profession, and one of the great things about becoming a barrister is it's brutal, and it teaches you to read large amounts of things in relatively short periods of time. It also teaches you not to kind of fuss about working hard. So I work from 7 in the morning till about 10 at night, and I read mountains of books. I usually work 7 days a week, and then every now and then that's just way too much, and then I kind of collapse and take a rest, and then I go back to it again. But I don't have a problem with working long hours, and fortunately, because it took me many years to write this book, even with the long hours.